Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a slightly delayed read aloud that Mark at Book Time with Elvis and I are doing for you of Anthony Trollope's novel, The Warden. We've been reading this aloud, and then we stopped for a while, and now we're back. And for those of you, I figure it's not that much of a fatal flaw because the point of this read aloud will be the playlist at the end. It won't be the length of time between the episodes. So we are going to start right where we left off with my next chapter, which is chapter 8. And to bring you up to speed just a bit on the basic plot of the novel, this is a story of a small town in England where a busybody named John Bold has discovered that according to the terms of the original will that set up a charitable hospital for a few of the old and luckless members of the community, these old beadsmen, according to the original terms of that will, which was made centuries ago, the trust is now worth a lot more money than they actually get doled out to them. And the person who runs, the warden who runs Hiram's hospital, is the main beneficiary of all of that extra money. He lives like a gentleman on £800 a year. And although John Bold has no stake in fixing that problem, he's not related to any of the beadsmen. Didn't know that the problem existed 2 weeks ago. And although he has every stake in the world in not fixing that problem because he's in love with the warden's daughter, he still sets about making trouble. And lawyers get involved. And sides are drawn between the people who want that investigated and maybe more money dispensed to the beadsmen at the expense of less money going to the warden, and people who just say the church is right. We should trust the church to do what's right. That is the basic plot. And of course, because it's a Trollope novel, you'll have all of the personal elements that will interweave from there. There are love stories and personal friendships that are being strained or broken. And that's where we are in chapter 8, when we get back to the pure comedy of the matter. The chapter is called Plumstead Episcopi, and that is the headquarters of the Archdeacon, who is a hilarious character in this book, as is his termagant wife, and he is very much on the side of the church knows best. Leave this alone. The reader must now be requested to visit the rectory of Plumstead Episcopi, and is as yet still mourning to ascend again with us into the bedroom of the Archdeacon. The mistress of the mansion was at her toilet, on which we will not dwell with profane eyes, but proceed into a small inner room where the doctor dressed and kept his boots and sermons. And here we will take our stand, premising that the door of the room was so open as to admit a conversation between our Reverend Adam and his valued Eve. "It's all your own fault, Archdeacon," said the latter. "I told you from the beginning how it would end, and Papa has no one to thank but you." "Good gracious, my dear," said the doctor, appearing at the door of his dressing room with his face and head enveloped in the rough towel with which he was violently using. "How can you say so? I am doing my very best." "I wish you had never done so much," said the lady, interrupting him. "If you'd just have let John Bold come and go there, as he and Papa liked, he and Eleanor," that's the daughter who he's in love with, "would have become married by this time, and we should not have heard one word about all of this affair," premising that on the idea that John Bold would not attack the living of his wife's father. "But, my dear—" "Oh, it's all very well, Archdeacon." She calls him Archdeacon, even in private. "And of course you're right. I don't for a moment think you'll ever admit that you could be wrong. But the fact is, you've brought this young man down upon Papa by huffing him as you have done." "But, my love—" "And all because you didn't like John Bold for a brother-in-law. How is she ever to do better? Papa hasn't a shilling, and though Eleanor is well enough, she has not at all the taking style of beauty. I'm sure I don't know how she's to do better than to marry John Bold. As well, indeed," added the anxious sister, giving the last twist to her last shoestring. Dr. Grantley, that's the Archdeacon, felt keenly the injustice of this attack, but what could he say? He certainly had huffed John Bold, certainly had objected to him as a brother-in-law, and a very few months ago the very idea had excited his wrath. But now matters were changed. John Bold has shown his power, and though he was as odious as ever to the Archdeacon, power is always respected, and the reverend dignitary began to think that such an alliance might not have been imprudent. Nevertheless, his motto was still no surrender. He would still fight it out. He still believed confidently in Oxford, in the bench of bishops, in Sir Abraham Haphazard, the lawyer, and in himself, and it was only when alone with his wife that doubts of defeat ever beset him. He once more tried to communicate this confidence to Mrs. Grantley, and for the 20th time began to tell her of Sir Abraham. "Oh, Sir Abraham," she said, collecting all her house keys into her basket before she descended. "Sir Abraham won't get Eleanor a husband. Sir Abraham won't get Papa another income when he has been worried out of the hospital. Mark what I tell you, Archdeacon. While you and Sir Abraham are fighting, Papa will lose his preferment. And what will you do with him then? And Eleanor on your hands. Besides, who's to pay Sir Abraham? I suppose he won't take the case up for nothing." And so the lady descended to family worship among her children and servants, and the pattern of a good and prudent life. Dr. Grantley was blessed with a happy and thriving family. There were first three boys, now at home from school for the holidays. They were called, respectively, Charles James, Henry, and Samuel. The two younger, there were 5 in all, were girls. The elder, Florinda, bore the name of the Archbishop of York's wife, whose godchild she was, and the younger had been christened Grisel, after a sister of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the boys are called Charles James, Henry, and Samuel, but the girls are called Florinda and Grisel. The boys were all clever and gave good promise of being well able to meet the cares and trials of the world, yet they were not alike in their dispositions, and each had his individual character and each his separate admirers among the doctor's friends. Charles James was an exact and careful boy. He never committed himself. He well knew how much was expected from the eldest son of the Archdeacon of Barchester, and was therefore mindful not to mix too freely with other boys. He had not the great talent of his younger brothers, but he exceeded them in judgment and the propriety of his demeanor. His fault, if he had one, was an over-attention to words instead of things. There was thought too much finesse about him, and even his father sometimes told him he was too fond of a compromise. The second was the Archdeacon's favorite son, and Henry was indeed a brilliant boy. The versatility of his genius was surprising, and the visitors at Plumstead Episcopi were often amazed at the marvelous manner in which he would, when called on, adapt his capacity to apparently most uncongenial pursuits. He appeared once before a large circle as Luther the Reformer, and delighted them with the perfect manner in which he assumed the character, and within 3 days he again astonished them by acting the part of a Capuchin friar to the very life. For this last exploit his father gave him a golden guinea, and his brothers said the reward had been promised beforehand in the event of Reformers being successful. He was also sent on a tour into Devonshire, a treat which the lad was most anxious of enjoying. His father's friends there, however, did not appreciate his talents, and sad accounts were sent home of the perversity of his nature. He was a most courageous lad, game to the backbone. It was soon known, both at home where he lived, and within some miles of Barchester Cathedral, and also at Westminster, where he was at school, that young Henry could box well and would never own himself beat. Other boys would fight while they had a leg to stand on, but he would fight with no leg at all. Those backing him would sometimes think him crushed by the weight of blows and faint with the loss of blood, and his friends would endeavor to withdraw him from the contest, but no. Henry never gave in, was never weary of the battle. The ring was the only element in which he seemed to enjoy himself, and while other boys were happy in the number of their friends, he rejoiced most in the multitude of his foes. His relations could not but admire his pluck, but they sometimes were forced to regret that he was inclined to be a bully, and those not so partial to him as his father was, observed with pain that though he could fawn to the masters and Archdeacon's friends, he was imperious and masterful to the servants and to the poor. But perhaps Samuel was the general favorite, and dear little Soapy, that's Trollope referring to Soapy Sam. It's a reference that you just have to roll with in Trollope. He will often interweave these things into just the lines of his prose, and they'll always be dutifully footnoted. I'm sure, this is footnoted in the Penguin version that I'm doing, but you don't need to worry about it. You don't need to go back and look at the note. You can just roll right over it. We're just going to roll right over it. And indeed, and dear little Soapy, we could actually say Sammy here. It wouldn't affect the reading at all. As he was familiarly called, was as engaging a child as ever fond mother petted. He was soft and gentle in his manners and attractive in his speech. The tone of his voice was melody, and every action was a grace. Unlike his brothers, he was courteous to all. He was affable to the lowly, meek even to the very scullery maid. He was a boy of great promise, minding his books and delighting the hearts of his masters. His brothers, however, were not particularly fond of him. They would complain to their mother that Soapy's civility all meant something, that they thought his voice was too often listened to at Plumstead Episcopi, and evidently feared that, as he grew up, he would have more weight in the house than either of them. There was, therefore, a sort of agreement among them to put young Soapy down. This, however, was not as easy to be done. Samuel, though young, was sharp. He could not assume the stiff decorum of Charles James, nor could he fight like Henry, but he was a perfect master of his own weapons, and contrived, in the teeth of both of them, to hold the place which he had assumed. Henry declared that he was a false, cunning creature, and Charles James, though he was always spoke of him as a dear brother Samuel, was not slow to say a word against him when opportunity offered. To speak the truth, Samuel was a cunning boy, and those even who loved him best could not but own that for one so young he was too adroit at choosing his words, and too skilled in modulating his voice. In other words, the boys are all crap heels. All three of them are horrible. Trollope is engaging here in high humor, in po-faced humor. He wants you to read these descriptions, which are studiously even-handed, but he wants you to come away thinking you wouldn't want to meet or know any of these three boys. The two little girls, Florinda and Griselle, were nice little girls enough, but they did not possess the strong sterling qualities of their brothers. Their voices were not often heard at Plumstead Episcopi. They were bashful and timid by nature, slow to speak before company, even when asked to do so. And though they looked very nice in their clean white muslin frocks and pink sashes, they were but little noticed by the Archdeacon's visitors. Very much intended there for you to read that you are to very little notice them either. They're non-entities. And that's not much better than their loutish brothers. Whatever of submissive humility may have appeared in the gait and visage of the Archdeacon during his colloquy with his wife in the sanctum of their dressing rooms was dispelled as he entered his breakfast parlor with erect head and powerful step. In the presence of a third person he assumed the lord and master, and the wise and talented lady too well knew the man to whom her life was bound to stretch her authority beyond the point at which it would be borne. In other words, she'll yell at him, she'll nag him in private, but not in the breakfast room in front of servants. Strangers at Plumstead Episcopi, when they saw the imperious brow with which he commanded silence from the large circle of visitors, children, and servants who came together in the morning to hear him read the word of God, and watched how meekly that wife seated herself behind her basket of keys with a little girl on each side as she caught that commanding glance, strangers, I say, seeing this, could little guess that some 15 minutes since she had stoutly held her ground against him, hardly allowing him to open his mouth in his own defense. But such is the tact and talent of women. Not sure what Anthony Trollope would know about that, but his readers liked it, and he knew perfectly well that 90% of his readers were women. Never forget that. No matter when you're reading him, never forget that. He was a pure creature of the market. And now let us observe the well-furnished breakfast parlor at Plumstead Episcopi, and the comfortable air of all the belongings of the rectory. Comfortable they certainly were, but neither gorgeous nor even grand. Indeed, considering the money that had been spent there, the eye and taste might have been better served. There was an air of heaviness about the rooms which might have been avoided without any sacrifice of propriety. Colors might have been better chosen, and lights more perfectly diffused. But perhaps in doing so, the thorough clerical aspect of the whole might have been somewhat marred. At any rate, it was not without ample consideration that those thick, dark, costly carpets were put down, those embossed but somber papers hung up, those heavy curtains draped so as to half exclude the light of the sun, nor were these old-fashioned chairs, bought at a price far exceeding that now given for more modern goods, without a purpose. The breakfast service on the table was equally costly and equally plain. The apparent object had been to spend money without obtaining brilliancy or splendor. The urn was of thick and solid silver, as were the teapot, coffee pot, cream ewer, and sugar bowl. The cups were old, dim dragon china, worth about £1 apiece, but very despicable in the eyes of the uninitiated. The silver forks were so heavy as to be disagreeable to the hand, and the bread basket was of weight really formidable to any but robust persons. The tea consumed was the very best, the coffee was the very blackest, the cream the very thickest. There was dry toast and buttered toast, muffins and crumpets, hot bread and cold bread, white bread and brown bread, homemade bread and baker's bread, wheaten bread and oaten bread, and if there were other breads than these, they were there. There were eggs in napkins and crispy bits of bacon under silver covers, and there were little fishes in a little box, and deviled kidneys frizzling on a hot water dish, which, by the way, were placed closely contiguous to the plate of the worthy Archdeacon himself. Over and above this, on a snow-white napkin, spread upon the sideboard, was a huge ham and a huge sirloin, the latter having laden the dinner table on the previous evening. Such was the ordinary fare at Plumstead Episcopi. And yet this archdeacon wants to deny those beadsmen an extra pound or two a day. And yet I have never found the rectory a pleasant house. The fact that the man shall not live by bread alone seemed to be somewhat forgotten. And noble as was the appearance of the host, and sweet and good-natured as was the face of the hostess, talented as were the children, and excellent as were the viands and wines, in spite of these attractions, I generally found the rectory somewhat dull. After breakfast, the archdeacon would retire, of course, to his clerical pursuits. Mrs. Grantley, I presume, inspected her kitchen, though she had a first-rate housekeeper with £60 a year, and attended to the lessons of Florinda and Griselle, though she had an excellent governess with £30 a year. But at any rate, she disappeared, and I never could make companions of the boys. Charles James, though he always looked as though there were something in him, never seemed to have much to say, and what he did say he would always unsay the next minute. He told me once that he considered cricket, on the whole, to be a gentlemanlike game for boys, provided they would play without running about, and that fives also was a seemly game, so that those who played it never heated themselves. So he's praising these games, but as long as you don't do them. Harry once quarreled with me over taking his sister Griselle's part in a contest between them as to the best mode of using a water pot for the garden flowers, and from that day to this he has not spoken to me, though he speaks at me often. For half an hour or so I certainly did like Sammy's gentle speeches, but one gets tired of honey, and I found that he preferred the more admiring listeners whom he met in the kitchen garden and back precincts of the establishment. Besides, I think I once caught Sammy fibbing. So notice this is an interesting instance. It doesn't always happen with Trollope. There's always a narrative presence in Trollope. There's always someone telling you the story, and it's not often Trollope. It's often someone else who's never identified, never specified. And we've seen this before. It's cropped up even in a little book like The Warden. But here, the narrator is telling you that he knows these boys, and that he has talked with them and quarreled with them. Which flies in the face of narrative technique in the 21st century, where if the narrator is an individual person, the reader bloody well wants to know who they are. That virtually never is done this way, that the narrator is unnamed, is never part of the story, but is an individual person. This person has been at Plumstead Episcopi. He has tried his best to make friends with the three odious boys. Anyway, I promised I would not interpolate too much. I will press on. On the whole, therefore, I found the rectory a dull house, though it must be admitted that everything there was of the very best. After breakfast, on the morning on which we are writing, the archdeacon, as usual, retired to his study, intimating that he was going to be very busy, but that he would see Mr. Chadwick if he called. On entering this sacred room, he carefully opened the paper case on which he was wont to compose his favorite sermons, and spread on it a fair sheet of paper, and one partly written on. He then placed his inkstand, looking at his pen, and folded his blotting paper. Having done so, he got up again from his seat, stood with his back to the fireplace, and yawned comfortably, stretching out vastly his huge arms and opening his burly chest. He then walked across the room and locked the door. He gets everything ready for his morning of his clerical duties, then he locks the door. And having so prepared himself, he threw himself into his easy-chair, took from a secret drawer beneath his table a volume of Rabelais, and began to amuse himself with the witty mischief of Pantagruel, of Panurge. And so passed the archdeacon's morning on that day. He's reading, and it's pleasure reading. He's not reading scripture or sermons. He's reading Rabelais. He was left undisturbed at his studies for an hour or two at his studies. When a knock came at the door, and Mr. Chadwick was announced. Rabelais retired into the secret drawer, and the easy-chair seemed knowingly to take itself off, and when the archdeacon quickly undid his bolt, he was discovered by the steward working, as usual, for that church of which he was so useful a pillar. Mr. Chadwick had just come from London, and was therefore known to be the bearer of important news. "We've got Sir Abraham's opinion at last," Mr. Chadwick said, as he seated himself. This is the lawyer's opinion about who's on the right side of the case of Hiram's Hospital. "Well, well, well," exclaimed the archdeacon impatiently. "Oh, it's as long as my arm," said the other. "It can't be told in a word. But you can read it," and he handed him a copy, in heaven knows how many spun-out folios, of the opinion which the Attorney General had managed to cram on the back and sides of the case as originally submitted to him. "The upshot is," said Chadwick, "that there's a screw loose in their case," meaning the opposite side, John Bold's side, "and we had better do nothing." They are proceeding against Mr. Harding and myself, and Sir Abram tells me that under the wording of the will and subsequent arrangements legally sanctioned, Mr. Harding and I are only paid servants. The defendants should have been the defendant should either have been the Corporation of Barchester or possibly the chapter or your father. Woohoo, said the Archdeacon. So Mr. Bold is on the wrong scent, is he? That's Sir Abram's opinion. But any scent almost would be the wrong scent. Sir Abraham thinks that if they'd taken the corporation or the chapter, we could have baffled them. The bishop, he thinks, would be the surest shot. But even there he could plead that the bishop is only a visitor, and that he has never made himself a consenting party to the performance of other duties. That's quite clear, said the Archdeacon. It's not, actually, but that's the whole joke. Not quite so clear, said the other. You see, the will says, quote, my lord the bishop, being graciously pleased to see that due justice be done, unquote. Now, it may be a question whether, in accepting and administering the patronage, your father has not also accepted other duties assigned. It is doubtful, however, that even if they hit that nail, and they are far off from that yet, the point is so nice. As Sir Abraham says, that you would force them into £15,000 cost before they could bring it to issue. Where's the sum of money to come from? In other words, Sir Abraham is saying he thinks they don't have a case to relitigate Hiram's will. But even if they do, it would cost them 5 times the amount of money that would be available to do. They can't. It's a case capable of prolongment, and that is deadly in terms of cost. The Archdeacon rubbed his hands with delight. He had never doubted the justice of his case, but he had begun to have some dread of unjust success on the part of his enemies. It was delightful to him thus to hear that their cause was surrounded with such rocks and shoals, such causes of shipwreck unseen by the landsman's eyes, but visible enough to the keen eyes of practical law mariners. How wrong his wife was to wish that Bold should marry Eleanor. Bold? Why, if he should be an ass enough to persevere, he would be a beggar before he knew whom he was at law with. No question of who Eleanor loves. It never enters his mind. That's excellent, Chadwick. That's excellent. I told you Sir Abraham was the man for us. And he put down on the table the copy of the opinion and patted it fondly. Don't let that be seen, though, Archdeacon. Who, I? Not for worlds, said the doctor. People will talk, you know, Archdeacon. Of course, said the doctor. Because if that gets abroad, it would teach them how to fight their own battle. Notice Chadwick is pressing the point. And I wonder why. Who could he be thinking would see this document and talk about it to everyone? That's not the Archdeacon. Quite true, said the doctor. No one here in Barchester ought to see that but you and I, Archdeacon. No, certainly no one else, said the Archdeacon, pleased with the closeness of the confidence. No one else shall. Mrs. Grantley is very interested in the matter, I know, said Mr. Chadwick. Did the Archdeacon wink, or did he not? I'm inclined to think he did not wink, but that without such, perhaps unseemly gesture, he communicated to Mr. Chadwick with the corner of his eye intimation that, deep as was Mrs. Grantley's interest in the matter, it should not procure for her a perusal of that document. And at the same time, he partly opened the small drawer above that spoken of, and deposited the paper on the volume of Rabelais, and showed to Mr. Chadwick the nature of the key which guarded these hidden treasures. The careful steward then expressed himself contented. Ah, vain man! Could he fasten up his Rabelais and other things secret with all the skill of Brahma or of Chubb, and the famous pickpockets and thieves? Again, you can just slide right over it. It's not important to the narrative. But where could he fasten up the key which solved these mechanical mysteries? Is it probable to us that the contents of no drawer in that house were unknown to its mistress? And we think, moreover, that she was entitled to all such knowledge. But, said Mr. Chadwick, we must, of course, tell your father and Mr. Harding so much of Mr. Abraham's opinion as will satisfy them that the matter is doing well. Oh, certainly. Yes, of course, said the doctor. You had better let them know that Sir Abraham is of the opinion that there is no case at any rate against Mr. Harding, and that as the action is worded at present, it must fall to the ground. They must be non-suited if they carry it on. You had better tell Mr. Harding that Sir Abraham is clearly of the opinion that he is only a servant, and as such not liable. Or if you like, I'll see Mr. Harding myself. Oh, I must see him tomorrow, and my father too, and I'll explain to them exactly why so much. You won't go before lunch, Mr. Chadwick? Well, if you will, you must, for I know your time is precious. And he shook hands with the diocesan steward and bowed him out. And the Archdeacon had again recourse to his drawer, and twice read through the essence of Sir Abraham Haphazard's law-enlightened and law-bewildered brains. It was very clear to Sir Abraham the justice of the old men's claim. It was very clear that to Sir Abraham the justice of the old man's claim, the beadsman of Hiram's Hospital, or the justice of Mr. Harding's defense, were ideas that never presented themselves. He didn't think about it, the right or wrong of the case at all. A legal victory over an opposing party was the service for which Sir Abraham was, as he imagined, to be paid, and that he, according to his lights, had diligently labored to achieve, and with probable hope of success. Of the intense desire which Mr. Harding felt to be assured on fit authority that he was wronging no man, that he was entitled to the true equity of his income, that he might sleep at night without pangs of conscience, that he was no robber, no spoiler of the poor, that he and all the world might be openly convinced that he was not the man which the Jupiter, the local muckraking paper, had described him to be. Of such longings on the part of Mr. Harding, Sir Abraham was entirely ignorant, nor indeed could it be looked upon as part of his business to gratify such desires. Such was not the system on which his battles were fought and victories gained. Success was his object, and he was generally successful. He conquered his enemies by their weakness rather than by his own strength, and it had been found almost impossible to make up a case in which Sir Abraham, as an antagonist, would not find a flaw. The Archdeacon was delighted with the closeness of the reasoning. To do him justice, it was not a selfish triumph that he desired. He would personally lose nothing by defeat, or at least what he might lose did not actuate him. But neither was it love of justice which made him anxious, nor even mainly solicitude for his father-in-law. He was fighting a part of a never-ending battle against a never-conquered foe, that of the Church against its enemies. And as has been made clear in earlier chapters, what he means is the Church's money. The Church's money against its enemies. He knew Mr. Harding could not pay all the expense of these doings. For these long opinions of Sir Abraham's, these causes to be pleaded, these speeches to be made, these various courts through which the case was, he presumed, to be dragged, he knew that he and his father must at least bear the heavier portion of this tremendous cost. But to do the Archdeacon justice, he did not recoil from this. He was a man fond of obtaining money, greedy of a large income, but open-handed enough in expanding it, and it was a triumph to him to foresee the success of this measure, although he might be called on to pay so dearly for it himself. And that is chapter 8. And we can see two things from this chapter, two main things. One is that the plot has been moved forward just a bit. We have the legal expert's opinion. And according to the legal expert, fighting and winning this case for John Bold would be almost impossible. It'd be ruinously expensive. And there's an argument to be made that it wouldn't be viable, that the warden is only a servant. It's not his fault if his own living has increased to £800 a year. He's not intentionally raking profits off the top. You might see a little bit of commentary on Trollope's part about where profit raking can get you, because the house that he describes at Plumstead Episcopi, with its staggering amount of standing food, is all from raking profits from the church of Plumstead Episcopi. But that one main item of the chapter is that the plot has moved forward a little. We now have Sir Abraham Haphazard's opinion, and it is that there isn't a case here. But we see something else that happens in this chapter that you have to get used to when you're dealing with Trollope. And you shouldn't be afraid to call a spade a spade. You shouldn't be afraid to call him out for it. Just because these books are in the Penguin Classic line and are canonical doesn't mean you can't see what the author is doing. Trollope wrote these things in installments first. The Warden was not a novel first. It was done in regular installments for a periodical. And he was paid in that way, a large amount of money for his time. And you can see that in this chapter, because look at all the make-weight stuff that's in this chapter. The sons of Archdeacon Grantley are not an important part of this story. We get a lavish amount of attention spent on them. Hundreds and hundreds of words. Trollope just kept writing. He felt it might be fun to describe them, so he just kept writing. We get a little bit about the daughters. They also are not involved in this story. We get a long, lavish description of the breakfast service at Plumstead Episcopi. It's totally unimportant. Trollope did it in order to fill out this chapter. He did it in order to make his word count for the period in which he was writing this part of his book. And I suppose there's an argument to be made that by doing that he wastes the reader's time, some of the reader's time. I suppose there's an argument to be made for that. There's certainly been an argument to be made for that along the lines of the way that most Victorian fiction was written, which was for periodical consumption paid by the word before it was collected into triple-decker novels that were tended to be paid in advance or by sales. Which means when you look at Victorian authors, you will see, whether it's Henry James or Charles Dickens or whoever, you will often be able to see padding like this. And now, it's pleasant padding. Trollope is a pleasant writer. It's always pleasant to read what he writes. But nevertheless, there isn't much to this chapter in terms of the book other than the news that Mr. Chadwick brings. And maybe a little foreshadowing of that it really shouldn't get out. This is not just Sir Abraham Haphazard's legal opinion. It's also a battle strategy for the opponents of Hiram's Hospital. So it must not get out. Will it get out? We'll find out. You will have to tune in to Mark's channel for Chapter 9. Thank you, BookTube.